For my safety, I don't want to reveal which park system I work for, but it is important to the story that I, female 19, work a position at a Michigan nature park, not entirely dissimilar to that of a park ranger. My job duties usually include manning the entry booth and locking up the buildings at night. And, although not a usual duty, sometimes they ask me to walk or take a park vehicle through some of the trails, as I am on the younger side but still have several years of experience at the park. I'm a relatively experienced outdoorsman. I've had some odd things happen to me while on the job that I can't quite explain. I'm decently well versed in some areas of the paranormal, and although not entirely relevant, it's of note that I am also a Norse pagan, as part of a family belief, and often wear protective symbols as well. To be honest, I've started wearing them more since these odd things have been happening. I've tried looking into it myself, but overall, I'm overwhelmed and not sure where to look, so a friend suggested I ask a forum like this about my experiences. There are two things in particular I want to ask about. Thing 1. I usually work the night shift, and this night in particular, it was raining a lot, and the conditions were getting unsafe. I was posted out in the booth, which has multiple miles from the office, so when things took a turn for the worse, my boss radioed me back. Some people who don't spend a lot of time in the woods don't realize how dark deep woods are, much less how dark things can get at night. But I had both a flashlight and the light from the booth, which gave me probably 30 feet of visibility. When I went to grab my stuff so I could lock up the booth and get to my car, I swore I saw something that moved very human-like, but moved oddly. The only way I can describe it is if a horse-deer hybrid tried to run like a person, but there were no people out there, and it was most definitely not a deer. I'm probably not describing in the best way, but it was very off. So I got to my car ASAP, and it didn't start right away. A bit odd, but not entirely out of character for my car. But when I turned the key a second time, right as the car started, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, and it looked like whatever it was had gotten closer. The drive goes without incident, but I'm still off about what I saw, and when I get closer to the office, I radio in to see if they needed me to pick up anyone, and the radio didn't work right, which was very out of character. These radios are designed to work in awful conditions, and I was the closest I'd been to any sort of signal in a while. I chalked it up to the weather and pulled into the office, but as soon as I do, something runs past me. I didn't get a good look at what it was, but it was not a person, and I'm telling you, there's not an animal in that woods that I know of that looks like either of the things that I saw, and I just can't seem to shake it. Thing 2. This happened more recently, and is what prompted me to finally reach out to a forum of some kind. I was walking the trails for security purposes, close to closing. We close around 11 p.m. and start a final walkthrough around 9 p.m. We do this to make sure no one's stuck on the trail or hurt, so they aren't stuck overnight, when there are fewer staff around and none that patrol those trails. So I was walking one of our trails and I was pretty deep in the woods, about 2 miles in, when things started to get weird. I hear a noise off in the distance, and at first, I thought it could be a coyote or an owl, so I pressed on. Coyotes stay off the trails and won't go after people unless they have dogs, and they know when and where we do outsweeps, so they stay a good distance away. But then the noises got weirder. I don't know. I'm used to the sounds of the woods, and I know the area and the wildlife very well, and I have never once in my life heard that sound before. It didn't come from any animal I recognize, and it most definitely was not human. I've never aborted a sweep before, even when I've had coyotes nearby, but it did not feel right, and I got out of there. We are allowed to use our judgment in these cases. If anyone has any idea what either of these things could be, please let me know. I'd really appreciate it. This happened when I was just in college. College was a period in my life where just a lot of creepy shit happened to me. I don't know what I was doing to attract so many weirdos at that time of my life, but I probably should have been evaluating my life choices a little more closely. But anyway, onto the story. During college, I worked as a tutor, but on the weekends, I would sometimes babysit for family friends. One of the kids was old enough that he didn't need a babysitter. We'll call him Chris. But he wasn't old enough to watch the younger kid, who we'll call Kevin. Thus, my presence on that night would prove to be, honestly, terrifying as fuck. I don't know, maybe you won't think it's as bad as I felt like it was. We'll see. Okay, so anyway, I was babysitting for this family one Saturday night. The parents didn't usually stay out too late, getting home at 10 p.m. or earlier even, on most nights. But this particular night was a special situation. I can't remember the circumstances of it now. But I mean, I was 19. I could stay out past 10 p.m. They figured they would be home by 1 a.m., and they said I was welcome to spend the night, but I'd already decided that would not be happening. That house honestly had a super weird vibe. It was kind of isolated. And they had all of these old buildings on the property. A silo, some sheds, a gigantic barn, etc. Maybe I've watched too many horror movies, but all I could think was that there were so many places for people to hide in those buildings. Plus, the house was really old too. And those always freak me out because, ghosts. So, I would not be spending the night. That was for sure. So, I was babysitting the kids, and Kevin wanted me to go help him find something in the basement. He had all these costumes that he used to like to dress up in. Once he scared the absolute shit out of me when he came up behind me in the dark wearing an ultra-realistic soldier costume, carrying a replica musket that I would have sworn was real, but turned out wasn't. I nearly lost my shit that night. The basement was the second creepiest part of the house. The creepiest was the attic, obviously, because attics are terrifying. So if he had asked me to go up there, it would have been a hard no. The basement wasn't fully finished, and it was really big with, lots of corners and turns and hallways and shit, all with a bunch of different rooms. It was actually my first time going beyond the stairway, and I kept thinking that if I had been aware of just how scary this basement was, there was no way in hell I would be babysitting in this house. But I, of course, didn't want to look like a wimp in front of a child, so I went with Kevin to his costume area, which was kind of deep into the basement, because of course it was. As we were looking for the costume, well, Kevin was looking. I was questioning my life choices that had led me up to that moment. We heard noises that can only be described as footstep-like upstairs. At first, I just said it must be Chris, but then Chris was just suddenly in the doorway, scaring the hell out of me. Seriously, no idea where the hell he came from. And he was like, "That's not me." And I remember this moment vividly. The three of us standing near this closet filled with various costumes of varying creepiness in this tiny room in a super sketch basement, listening to what we thought were footsteps upstairs. Well, this is how we die, I thought, weirdly kind of at peace with that. But that only lasted a second before I thought, fuck that shit, and I looked around for a weapon. Of course, there was nothing because I was in a child's playroom, and the rest of the basement had little within it, apart from a washer and a dryer, which would make a poor weapon, unless I could somehow push it onto someone. But that seemed unlikely to happen in this particular situation. In the end, I settled on this random crowbar. It was just lying on the floor, and neither kid knew why. I cannot express how creepy this basement was. Anyway, and I prepared to meet our fate while considering just how much of a risk I was willing to take to keep these kids safe. It was at this moment that I realized something. Their dog wasn't barking. The family had this golden retriever named Lily, who would bark at damn near everything, and she wasn't barking. So, I rationalized that the sounds were just noises that an old house would make. Plus, I realized when we heard the noises, we weren't actually under the house itself based on the layout of the basement. We were technically under the porch. So even if there was someone, it wasn't anyone in the actual house. It could have been anyone. A delivery driver being the most likely explanation. So I felt a lot better. But you bet your ass I kept that crowbar. So the kids and I went upstairs, where we found Lily fast asleep. Once upstairs, I went to the porch and very cautiously opened the door to look for any possible package. It was winter, so it got dark early, meaning it was feasible that a delivery driver would still be working after the sun went down. But, naturally, there was no package. Of course there wasn't, right? I wouldn't be posting here if that's how this story ended. By this point, I was stressed the hell out, but the kids were over it. They were playing video games, and I was Googling the crime rates in this town. And all of a sudden, Lily perked up and started barking like a maniac. A second later, I heard a knock on the door. I just could not catch a break. With my crowbar in hand, I walked to the door, and I could see through the frosted window in the door that someone was standing there. I couldn't make out their features, but someone was there. Since I'm not a total idiot, I didn't open the door, but I did ask through the doorway who it was. The man on the other side of the door said they had a pizza delivery, and you already know what I'm about to say. We did not order a pizza. This was before everyone had cell phones, so the boys couldn't have ordered one. Plus, they had been dead to the world while they played video games. And if the parents had ordered pizza, they would have told me. So, naturally, I again was prepared to fight for my life. I gripped a crowbar, and I told the guy we hadn't ordered a pizza, and I thought for sure he was going to insist and try to get me to open the door, but surprisingly, he didn't. He just said, "Oh, sorry, my mistake," and he turned and left. At this point, I had a lot of questions, as one would when facing a series of unusual events in a creepy house in the middle of nowhere. So as I saw the guy walk off the porch through the frosted window, I opened the door just slightly. I wanted to see this guy, in case I needed to identify him out of a lineup or something eventually. But by the time I opened the door, he was walking away, so I only saw his back. But I immediately noticed two strange things. I didn't see a pizza in his hands, and I didn't see his car. The latter I could rationalize because he might have parked on the street, which would have been strange since they had a large horseshoe-shaped driveway, but, maybe. But there was no pizza. I guess technically it might have just been blocked from my view, but I doubted that very much. I almost called him out on this too, in a burst of ill-timed bravery, but then I realized that if I did, he would know the jig was up, and he would have nothing to lose. So, I just closed and locked the door. Later that night, Lily was again knocked out, and the kids were upstairs in bed. I didn't think I'd fall asleep. I was sitting there with a crowbar in my hands, on high alert, like I was about to be in a fight for my life. In hindsight, maybe it was a bit of an overreaction, but I wasn't going to be one of those idiots who dies because they underestimated a threat level. I might as well have suggested the kids and I split up, which, of course, I realized in that moment that was essentially what happened. They wouldn't have been much help to me anyway. Eventually, I did fall asleep for about half an hour or so, when I was awoken by the sound of an owl. I'm a light sleeper, so either the owl hooting woke me up, or else it was just a coincidence. Only, it didn't sound quite right. It sounded almost like an owl, but something was off about it. As I look back on this now, what I did next was extraordinarily foolish, given the events that had transpired that night. But I think my tired brain wasn't working fast enough. That's the real killer in horror movies: exhaustion. So in my fatigued state, I decided to investigate. I went to the door and listened. The owl was still hooting, but it still sounded weird. I couldn't quite figure out why it sounded so off. And this is when I did another stupid thing. I opened the door. With the door open, I could hear the owl a little better, and I looked into the darkness, shining the light on my phone around. Suddenly, I heard the owl again, and I honest to God gasped because this was when it all came together. The hooting didn't sound like an actual owl. It sounded like someone imitating an owl. Even recalling it now for this story is giving me chills. Maybe it doesn't sound like a lot, but it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The moment I realized this, my heart was about to fucking pound right out of my chest. I still had the beam of light from my phone pointed into the darkness, and that was when I saw it reflected off of a set of eyes that were at the level that humans would be. I wasn't tired anymore, so I came to my senses, locked the door, barricaded it with a chair, and retreated into the living room after checking all of the downstairs windows. I also grabbed a big knife from the kitchen, like a Michael Myers style knife, because at this point, I legitimately thought I might need it. I really contemplated calling the police, but what was I going to tell them? That something outside was making owl noises and had eyes? They would tell me that it's just an owl and then hang up on me. So, I just sat on the couch again, this time clutching the knife and crowbar, and I tried not to think about all the horror stories that I had read or seen, especially the ones involving well-meaning babysitters meeting gruesome ends. But I was not successful, and so I did not fall asleep again. Around midnight, the couple came home. I had texted them to kind of warn them without sounding like I had completely lost any shred of sanity that I had left. I just said that I thought I heard someone outside, so be careful when they got home. They were unbothered because they lived in some bizarro world where bad things didn't ever happen to good people. They walked in nonchalantly while I put the knife away, before they saw me clinging to it like a shipwrecked victim clings to any piece of floating debris they can find. And this was when they told me that they thought they heard someone outside a few nights ago. Because of course, this wasn't something you should tell your babysitter beforehand. I mean, why would I need to know that? So I took my well-earned money, ran to my car, and got the hell out of there. Once I got home, I realized I still had the crowbar. And I won't lie to you, I never brought it back. I mean, because of their critical omission of information, I lived what was very nearly an actual nightmare. So, I earned that crowbar too. And that was the end of my babysitting career. Only one other time did I babysit for them, and that was during a legit medical emergency one of the parents was having. Luckily, everything turned out fine in the end. I mean, I couldn't turn them down when they called me in desperation. And nothing weird happened that night, thank God, because I don't think I would have the mental capacity to deal with this shit again. But you know, even after all of these years, I know one thing with absolute certainty. That was not an owl. I don't believe in anything paranormal, but I can't think of any rational way to explain what I saw. This happened in mid-November, but I still think about it a lot. I live on the coast of Lake Michigan, where it's common for sea glass to wash up on the beach. It's been a hobby of mine to collect it since I was a little kid, and my mom and I would collect it on the beach near our house. I prefer to go in the late fall or early spring when nobody else is there to pick up the good pieces, and the wind isn't too cold yet. There's a park near where I live that is especially good for sea glassing. It's tucked in between private properties, so not a lot of people know about it. And in mid-November, the beach is completely empty. There's a paved trail that leads from the parking lot down through the ravine to the beach house. But on this day, I felt like exploring a bit. I walked along the top of the bluff until I found a small unmarked trail, and I decided to follow that. It led down to the beach, but I couldn't find a good access point that didn't involve climbing, so I kept walking. Eventually, it led to a dead end. I turned around to walk back, and as I did, I heard something thump loudly on the ground, like it fell out of a tree. Then, suddenly, I heard the sound of something charging through the brush, straight towards me. It sounded large, like a bear, but there aren't any bears in my area. I instinctually made myself look big, and I shouted, "Hey!" in a deep voice. Except, my voice isn't deep, so just imagine that was really deep. Imagine that was like the deepest voice you could ever imagine in your entire life. The deepest T6 voice possible. Whatever it was stopped about 20 feet away from me. I stood there staring at the spot for about 30 seconds, before cautiously continuing back up the trail. I went back to one of the clearings and climbed down onto the beach. The whole time I was walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that somebody was watching me. The beach was empty though, so I figured I was still just shaken up from whatever happened in the woods. I also kept hearing a second set of footsteps in the gravel behind me, matching my pace exactly. But since nobody else was on the beach, I figured it was just an echo. Then, I got to the beach house. I had to pee, so I went behind it to see if the bathroom was open. As I turned the corner, I saw something peeking around the far side of the building at me. It had a human-like body, but it was about 7 feet tall, and it had deer antlers sprouting from its head. Its skin was so pale white that it was translucent. I could see the blue of its blood vessels. It also had no discernible facial features. It had the bone structure of a face, but no eyes or mouth or anything. I immediately started sprinting up the main trail. I'm very out of shape, but I ran the whole way up the bluff. I thought I was going to pass out when I got to my car, but I didn't take a second to catch my breath before driving away. I drove to a nearby restaurant, and while I was there, I texted my friend about it. He told me I was just upset about some other things going on in my life, and that I was just seeing things. It felt very real to me, but I accepted that. I was feeling very emotional that day, and maybe my brain was just playing tricks on me because of it, but months later, I still can't get it out of my mind. It felt so real. If it was real, it had to be a cryptid, so I'm making this post now to ask you all what it could be. On the night of October 27th, 1945, 54-year-old widow Martha Brandenburg was peacefully sleeping in her rural Sulphur, Indiana home when a sudden frantic knock startled her awake. Opening the door, Martha found her 15-year-old neighbor, Lucy Berkeley. Lucy informed Martha that her barn was on fire. Around 10:45 p.m., Lucy and her boyfriend Harley Walton were returning from a date when they spotted the blaze from the road. While Lucy rushed to inform Martha of the situation, Harley tried in vain to extinguish the fire before seeking help from a neighbor. Unfortunately, the flames spread rapidly, engulfing the entire structure within minutes. As Martha stood by helplessly watching her uninsured barn succumb to the flames, her thoughts turned to her animals. Fortunately, her 3 cows had been left to graze in the pasture that evening. However, Martha was suddenly struck with a pang of dread. Her beloved pet pig, a 75-pound crippled sow that she had rescued from certain euthanasia, was locked inside a stall within the barn. When Martha expressed her sadness over the loss of her pig to Lucy, Lucy reassured her that the animal was safe, having spotted the sow on her way to inform Martha about the fire. As Martha surveyed the field, she was astonished to find her pig peacefully sleeping in the grass, unharmed. Puzzled by how the sow, with its very limited mobility, could have possibly escaped on its own, Martha simply accepted it as a fortunate miracle. The following morning, however, as the shock of the previous night began to fade, Martha's thoughts again returned to the pig. A chilling scenario suddenly ran through her mind. Perhaps a tramp had sought shelter in the barn and inadvertently released the sow before falling victim to the fire themselves. Martha began sifting through the barn's remains, searching for anything to suggest that someone had been inside. She unearthed an umbrella frame, an alarm clock, a pair of scissors, a tin can filled with metal buttons, tweezers, and several charred pieces of clothing, none of which she recognized as hers. Martha traveled to the nearby English, Indiana police station to present the items that she had recovered from her barn to Sheriff Lovell. Lovell accompanied Martha back to her property and, upon his own investigation, unearthed a pair of earrings and the remnants of a woman's handbag in the debris where the barn once stood. Meanwhile, 60 miles away, just outside of Rockport, Indiana, police were grappling with a perplexing mystery of their own. That afternoon, local farmer John Spady stumbled upon a patch of freshly disturbed earth in one of his expansive fields. As he inspected the area closely, he noticed a distinctive rake mark pattern on the loose dirt. John immediately suspected that loot from a recent bank robbery might be concealed beneath the disturbed soil. On the night of October 18th, an unknown number of individuals forcibly entered Richland, Indiana's Lake State Bank, located just under 15 miles from John's farm, with the intent of plundering the bank's safety deposit boxes. The perpetrators succeeded with an undisclosed quantity of jewelry and cash from the boxes. The robbery remained undetected until the following morning, as the thieves had also stolen the bank's alarm system. After notifying the sheriff of his discovery, John enlisted the help of a neighbor, and the pair began to dig. However, when they unearthed a woman's shoe instead of the expected stolen money, they ceased their efforts and awaited the arrival of police. With law enforcement present, the digging resumed, approximately 1.5 feet below the surface. the men made a horrifying discovery: the bodies of two individuals, a man and a young woman, interred in the dirt. The body of the man, who appeared to be quote-unquote middle-aged, was discovered positioned atop the younger woman's body. He was fully clothed, dressed in a gray business suit over an olive green dress shirt. The young woman was described as a young teen. She had brunette hair, weighed 110 pounds, and was wearing a sweater and matching skirt. Hidden within the young woman's bra, police found $3,200 in cash, tightly wrapped in an envelope. No identification was found on either individual. However, a matchbook from the 121 Club, a betting parlor for horse racing, was recovered from the man's pocket. An autopsy revealed that the man had been subjected to a brutal beating before being fatally shot, twice in the abdomen, once in the head, and once in the heart, all with a .38 caliber pistol. The woman's injuries were much more severe. Her face had been horrifically disfigured with an instrument, quote-unquote, resembling a screwdriver. A rope was found so tightly secured around her neck, it had cut deeply into her, and her body bore numerous bruises, cuts, and defensive wounds. She too had been executed, with 2 gunshot wounds to the head, one of which went through her red eye, again, all with a .38 caliber pistol. After taking their fingerprints, it wasn't long before the pair was identified as 34-year-old George Tyson, a father and husband from East St. Louis, Illinois, and 18-year-old Ethel Mae Sparks, a waitress from the same area. As fate would have it, George was a wanted man. 3 months prior, on July 16th, 27-year-old union iron worker Joe Callahan was seated in his vehicle. 3 months prior, on July 16th, 27-year-old union iron worker Joe Callahan was seated in his vehicle outside Dolly's Tavern, a local dive bar in Madison, Illinois. He was accompanied by several friends, including 22-year-old Catherine Morrison, a waitress at the establishment. According to Catherine and the other witnesses present, 2 men approached the vehicle and engaged in a heated argument with Joe. After one assailant struck Joe in the head, he exited the vehicle, and a brief physical altercation ensued. When Joe returned to the car, one of the assailants produced a firearm and shot Joe before fleeing the scene. Despite sustaining severe injuries, Joe miraculously survived. Both Joe and Catherine quickly identified the gunman as George Tyson, a former union iron worker who was known to frequent the bar where Catherine worked. George, however, managed to evade capture and remained at large. 1 week later, however, a tragic turn of events unfolded within the same establishment. As Catherine sat at one of the tavern's booths that evening, an unknown individual silently cut the screen of a nearby window and inserted the barrel of a 12-gauge shotgun. A single shot rang out, striking Catherine and fatally wounding her. George was immediately identified as a prime suspect in the shooting. During witness interviews, detectives learned Catherine was seated at the booth with another woman, Ethel Sparks, the rumored mistress of George Tyson. Ethel was subsequently interviewed but denied being present at the time of the shooting or having a relationship with George. She was released, and 1 week later, Ethel left town. Following the identification of George and Ethel, detectives focused their investigation on the matchbook discovered in George's pocket. This led them to Jeffersonville, Indiana, where authorities uncovered evidence that George and Ethel had rented an apartment together under the assumed names of Mr. and Mrs. George Harris. According to local residents, the couple were reclusive, spending most of the day indoors and venturing out only at night. Neighbors told detectives they had last spotted the pair on October 27th, when they were seen entering a vehicle with 3 unidentified men in quote-unquote fancy suits. They reported that the 5 individuals departed in the morning, returned briefly that evening, and were observed leaving that residence again, with some of their belongings in hand. Upon learning of the discovery of the pair's bodies, Sheriff Lovell contacted the investigating department to inform them about the items recovered from Martha's barn. Law enforcement presented these items to several employees of local Jeffersonville establishments, as well as neighbors of George and Ethel. Multiple individuals positively identified the earrings as belonging to Ethel. Furthermore, Martha was presented with a piece of rope found around Ethel's neck and confirmed it matched the type of rope she had stored in her barn. Police now possessed enough information for a plausible timeline of events. They theorized that on October 27th, the three men in suits forcibly abducted the couple from their Jeffersonville apartment and transported them to a sulfur. At this location, the pair were tortured and ultimately murdered in Martha's barn. The assailants then set fire to the barn in an attempt to destroy evidence. George and Ethel's bodies were then transported to Rockport and buried on John's farm. As the investigation progressed, Alice Tyson, George's wife, came forward to claim the remains of her deceased husband and lay claim to the money discovered in Ethel's bra. Alice asserted that these funds originated from the recent sale of the couple's house. However, it was later revealed that the house, described as shabby and run down, had sold for a mere $600 due to a substantial mortgage. During her interview with law enforcement, Alice stated that she had last seen George the day before the shooting of Joe Callahan. She also denied any knowledge of his relationship with Ethel. Following the police interview, she departed town with their 8-year-old son. Ethel Sparks' parents traveled from their Arkansas hometown to claim the remains of their deceased daughter. They explained that Ethel had left a year prior in search of employment opportunities in East St. Louis. However, they hadn't spoken to her in several months. They claimed to not know of George and Ethel's alleged relationship. The Sparks family also asserted their claim to the recovered funds, suggesting that the money was most likely their daughter's life savings. Further investigation into Ethel's life revealed her association with several known criminal figures. Upon moving to East St. Louis, she secured employment as a waitress at an illicit casino operated by the wife of gangster Art Newman. During her tenure there, Ethel witnessed a shooting involving a man named Patrick Hogan, a prominent figure in the gambling underworld. Bizarrely, Patrick's body was never found, and he was never seen again. Law enforcement also discovered that following the shooting, Ethel had taken residence in an apartment situated above the Paddock Bar, owned by notorious gang boss Frank Buster Wortman. Unfortunately, any potential connection between Ethel's relationships with these criminal figures and her subsequent murder could not be proven. Ethel Mae Sparks was laid to rest in Arkansas's Lone Tree Cemetery. George Rosby Tyson was buried in Williamson Cemetery, located in Montgomery County, Georgia. Regrettably, despite an investigation spanning several years, the case was never solved. This happened quite a few years ago. I had an affinity for a particular white substance in the form of lions back then. One very cold, snowy night around 11 p.m., I went for a walk to meet my dealer. I'd never been to his place before, so he gave me the address to his small 2-story apartment building with maybe 6 units in it. Upon arrival, I noticed several strangers inside. After they had hit their pipes, 2 clearly unwashed guys came over to sit at the dining table while I waited for my G. I've never smoked anything besides weed and cigarettes, and so I was instantly uncomfortable. They tried making small talk, but I grew increasingly uneasy, giving only short, vague answers. I quickly paid for my stuff, grabbed the baggie, and I got up from the table. That's when one of the guys offered to walk me home, and my heart started to sink. I politely declined. "Oh, I'm okay, thanks. I don't live far." The other guy stood up. "No, really, we can walk you. We don't mind. We've got to get going anyway." And that's when my instincts finally kicked in. I became very aware and very scared. I immediately thought, I'm fully dressed and ready to go, but they still have to put on their coats and shoes. If I leave now, I'll get a head start and quickly disappear. They said something else as I headed for the door, but I pretended to take a phone call, waved goodbye to my dealer, and closed the door behind me. I jogged down the hallway to the outside door, and once I got outside, I ran for the street. I decided not to take the fast route home because, from the building, they would be able to see me. I didn't want them knowing even the slightest direction I lived in if they really were following me. The building was at the end of the street, so instead of going straight up the hill, the way I initially came from, I turned right and started jogging. I kept glancing back and, finally, I saw them, about a block behind, following me. The street I needed, Stanley Street, was across the intersection on my left, about another block ahead at a four-way light. As I approached the intersection, I noticed a corner house on my right. There was an older man sitting on his porch, smoking. I recognized him. He was another dealer I had met only once a few weeks before, when my usual guy was dry. I choked up as I got to his porch and asked if he remembered me. He did, and he asked, "What's wrong?" I quietly told him, "I think these two guys are following me," and I asked if I could go inside for a minute until they passed. He didn't even hesitate. We went inside, past his front living room, and into the kitchen, where I explained what happened. He told me not to worry, that I was safe there, and I could stay as long as I needed to. Then we heard a knock at the door, and I started to panic. He went to the door, looked through the peephole, and yelled, "Just a minute!" He came back quickly and whispered that he knew the guys and was going to invite them in to have a hit. He told me to sneak out through his back door, which was beyond the kitchen, go to the right of the yard, and find the gate. This would lead to a side street. He instructed me to creep along the side of his house, close to the shrubs, and check the porch to make sure they went inside. I followed his plan, and when the coast was clear, I didn't jog. I sprinted up Stanley Street and zigzagged all the way home. When I think back now, I'm in disbelief at my actions and how foolish I was. I thought I was invincible. I was far too trusting, but I truly thank God for the man who helped me that night. I don't know what those two guys wanted from me, but I'm forever grateful I never had to find out. I never post anything on Reddit, but I have to share this story because it affected me as a child. When I was about 12 or 13, I used to play a lot of video games with my best friend, and we often played shooters together. As you can imagine, it's easy to get frustrated, and at one point, I ended up breaking my PlayStation controller. Since I didn't have a spare and couldn't continue playing, I told my friend that I had to stop. He said I could come over and borrow his second controller since he didn't live far away. It was just a short walk. I thought, okay, and told him I would be over soon. So I grabbed my keys and started walking to his house. It was already dark, and since it was winter, it was snowing and very foggy. While walking, I had a strange feeling like I was being watched. I kept looking around, but I didn't see anyone. When I arrived at his place and picked up the controller, I saw through a window that a man was standing in the middle of the street. I pointed out to my friend, and we both wondered who or what was standing there. It looked like a person, but we couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette. Eventually, we decided to go outside and see if the person needed help or if something was wrong. We stepped outside and asked what was going on, but there was no response. The person just stared at us and then walked away. We were both confused and told his parents, but they just brushed it off, thinking we were imagining things because we played too many video games. After a while, I figured it was time to head home, since we had played video games together for a while. I almost forgot about the strange encounter, but when I was walking back, I started to feel that same eerie sensation, like I was being watched. I saw a few passerbyers, but they all seemed normal, nothing strange. But just before I got home, I looked behind me one last time, and I saw that person again, this time standing behind a tree, staring at me. Then they started walking toward me, and eventually they began running. I could tell it was an older man, probably around 60, but I was surprised at how fast he was running. He was shouting something in a language that I didn't understand, but he didn't seem happy. I ran for my life, clutching my keys, and I tried to unlock my front door as fast as possible. When I got inside, I quickly glanced back, but the man was gone. I rushed to my room and immediately told my friend about what had just happened. He suggested I call the police, which I did. However, since my description wasn't very detailed, the police took a report, but didn't seem to take it too seriously. My parents were visibly shocked, but nothing ever came of it. In my village, 4 other people reported similar experiences, saying that someone was watching or following them. I was one of them, but no one was ever caught by the police. To this day, no one knows who this man is, whether he's just trying to scare people or if it's something more sinister. No one knows for sure, but everyone agrees that it seems to be a man around 60 years old. Beyond that, no one can give a detailed description. That day, I feared for my life. I've told many of my friends about this, and I've received mixed reactions. Some said it sounded like a spooky campfire story, while others believed me and were visibly scared. Some even told me that they had experienced the same thing. Alright, buckle up. I've been holding this in for far too long. My blackout curtains are drawn, the scent of sage and desperation lingers in the air, and I can't sleep because my mind is consumed by him. You know who I'm talking about. The winged wonder, the red-eyed enigma, the legend. Moth Man. Listen, I don't care what the skeptics say. Oh, he's just a cryptid. Oh, he's just an urban legend. Oh, he's a harbinger of doom. Well, you know what? I'm a harbinger of love, baby. And I'm going to woo that 6-foot-something winged beefcake straight out of the Point Pleasant prophecies and into my arms. Let's just talk about it for a second. First of all, the guy has range. He's got mystery. He's got power. And oh, did I mention he can fly? That's right. He's the embodiment of a red flag boyfriend, but with wings and the ability to warn me about bridge collapses, tell me that's not romantic. Every time I see those artist renditions of him, wings spread wide, muscles rippling, don't at me, he definitely lifts dead trees for fun. Glowing eyes that could see into my soul. I am telling you right now, my standards for men have been obliterated. Mothman isn't just my type. He's my destiny. I've been prepping for this. I bought a spotlight and rigged it to glow crimson because I read somewhere that red light attracts him. My neighbors think I'm starting a cult. Maybe I am. Who's asking? I've been hanging out in the woods, whispering his name into the void, hoping he hears me. I even learned how to make moth pheromone candles, and let me tell you, the trial and error process on that was a nightmare. But you know what? Love takes work. I know some of you are probably thinking, this is unhealthy, or you need therapy. Well, guess what? I already go to therapy, and you know what my therapist said? I've never had a patient quite like you. Exactly. That's called being iconic. So yeah, call me delusional, call me obsessed, but I'm putting this out there into the ether. Mothman, if you're out there reading Reddit in your downtime between warning people of disaster, please know I'm here, waiting. My arms and heart are wide open. And if you're not Mothman, but you know a good summoning ritual, drop it in the comments. I'm not saying I'm desperate, but, well, I am. Love is real, and it's shaped like a cryptid Giga Chad with wings. So, see you in the woods, baby. Sincerely, future Mr. Mothman's husbando.